Good morning. Welcome to plenary session 1, the global economy in transition, looking for the next source of growth. This session is in lack of time, so we'd like to move a little faster. So I ask each presenter to present maybe 20 minutes, and then we will discuss about 30 minutes. So this session will end about 12:10. And we are joined today by two very prominent speakers. Professor Richard Friedman, Professor of Economics at Harvard University, and Professor Ann Kruger from Stanford University and Johns Hopkins University. Professor Richard Friedman is a world-renowned labor economist and a prolific writer. He has authored many highly prestigious books and articles. Professor Ann Kruger is a highly esteemed international economics expert and also pro-international free trade. She served as vice president at the World Bank between 1982 and 1986. At the IMF, she was first deputy managing director from 2001 and 2006. Thank you very much to speakers to be with us today to discuss this very important topic. As moderator, my name is Junyoung Kim. I am professor of economics and the president of Sungkyunkwan University. And may I ask everyone to welcome our prominent speakers with warm applause. So I'd like to invite Richard Friedman to present his paper.
Thank you. I'm going to use this PowerPoint for the paper. And let me just say this, I've been to Korea many times, and it is great to be associated with a successful economy and an economy that did perhaps the best in the world in recovering from the current crisis. And you see from the title here, my presentation is about, I think, the key part of globalization, which is knowledge. And that's what I'm going to be pushing. The traditional view of globalization is what matters is trade, capital flows, exchange rates, things like that, exports, imports, and then immigration a bit, but that's really not what trade specialists look at. And on this first slide, I just give you a series of two indices from two different groups, one from a Swiss group and one from, it's the Ernst & Young and the Economist from Britain, their international unit. And they created indices of globalization. And when I looked at these indices, I was looking to see how much stress they put on knowledge flows and international students, things like that I regard as fundamental. And they mention them a little bit. What was interesting is the Swiss had are you part of the global culture, which meant that they counted up how many McDonald's there were in your country, and how many McDonald's you had meant you were part of the global culture. But nowadays, of course, we could ask how many Chinese restaurants there are, how many Korean restaurants there are, how many pizza places there are. I noticed a lot of pizza places here in Seoul. And then they also said, are you involved in all kinds of international agencies and missions? And then they ranked the countries, and I just put down the ranking for Korea and the United States. So I'm going to argue that those rankings are really very misleading in terms of the knowledge flows that I think is more important. The other index from the Economist and Ernst & Young, again, they put heavy weight on trade, capital flows, the traditional globalization issues. They had a little bit about exchange of technology, and again, some cultural things. So these globalization measures are wider than I certainly expected when I looked at them to see how they were put together, but they underplay, from my perspective, the important things. And there again, you see there Korea and the U.S. were, I think, far lower than they should be. Given the tremendous amount of international educational things going on in both places. So my theme is we shouldn't put that great a stress on those, we shouldn't overstress those traditional measures. We should be looking a lot at what's happening through knowledge. And I put here a set of things. One, the expansion of higher education, the development of university system, and we heard from the Minister of Education earlier about the developments in Korea here. Korea is obviously one of the leading countries in the world now in higher education people. Immigration of high-level workers, and there the United States is really the leader. And we sometimes imagine that if we did not have all of the international immigrants, many of our universities would effectively close down. I think in my university, half the professors would disappear. The science labs would have nobody doing the actual work, and it would be a disaster for us. And I know Korea would like to get into that vein as well, particularly given demographic changes where there'll be fewer young people, and you need young people from around the world. We then have investments in R&D, and that's our contribution to the creation of knowledge around, and the knowledge is global, so that's why it's so important. And here, as you probably know, Korea is, I think, about a 3.5% R&D to GDP, which is really quite high, but of course a small country has got to be high because they're just as economies of scale in that aspect. And then, for the most interneted economy in the world, which we are here, it's the ideas through modern information and communication technology. Things can spread extraordinarily rapidly, and so you can be globalized even if you don't have that much physical trade or foreign investment kinds of things, as long as the ideas go. And then Anne may take a little bit, not offense, but I said this is a very different set of policy issues than the Washington Consensus, World Bank, IMF vision of globalization. And years ago, when I think there was a downplaying of the importance of the spread of ideas and knowledge. So why do we believe this is so important to the current world? Our economy today is an economy of dissemination and production of knowledge. The dissemination is what goes on inside the universities. And basically now every university in the world uses similar texts that certainly in science and engineering, they have got to teach, modern science and engineering. If you have a math, it's got to be calculus. And the calculus is the same whatever country it is. There may be better textbooks and worse ones. We don't have the strange world we had in the old Soviet Union days when they were teaching a different form of biology called Lyshenkoism. Now everyone now is reading off the same page. In many places, and certainly in some universities in Korea, you use English for your graduate studies because you cannot attract foreign students unless you do in English. If you are a Norwegian university and you expect to get students to come from other parts of Europe, they're not going to come if they have to learn Norwegian in order to take graduate classes. That doesn't work. So we do have this phenomenon. I am very much impressed with the role of international students and immigrants, but I'll put the big stress on the students that I think we tend to underplay how important they are and the effects that they have. I call them here carriers of knowledge in a knowledge pandemic. And that's whatever happens with the trade treaties, as long as we keep the students flowing and the knowledge flowing, we will indeed be moving towards this convergence of the world in critical dimensions. And then I will talk a little bit about standards and ideas that have become more disseminated. And then we have the production, which I think has two parts to it, because the stress on the R&D, which is correct, but most scientists and engineers, and certainly most university graduates, do not work in R&D facilities. And I'm sure that's true in Samsung, as I know it is true in the major IBM and the major US corporations. And what are they doing? I think they also are part of the knowledge thing that is also increasing our productivity and making for better business and better performance. So I'm going to give you some figures about how this has been changing in the world. And the first is enrollments of people in higher education. And here the key message is the decline of the US, and this is, Gordon Brown said, inevitable. Well, he was referring to shares of the world GDP, but I'm referring to the shares of enrollments. 1970, the earliest year I could get data from the United Nations for, the US had 29% of university people enrolled in a country that had 5% of the world's population. Extraordinary. Cannot be maintained as long as countries in the world are intelligent enough to invest in higher education, which they've been. And so now it's down, as of 2010, to 11%. And obviously it's going to get smaller. The Americans, we hope it stays above the 5% of our share of the world. And then I put the other advanced countries, and that's Europe, Japan, Australia, etc. And they also have declined much more slowly as a share because they were way behind the Americans at the beginning of this period. And then we have the developing countries, and the giant phenomenon in the developing countries is the growth of China and India. And it's important to understand that 30 million people in China today enrolled in institutions of higher education. That is what, 60% of the population of Korea. That is bigger than the population of 10 modest-sized European countries. You know, Norway and Switzerland and Sweden and Belgium, etc. You can count up the countries. So we are seeing incredible globalization in higher education. And again, everybody learning more or less the same, certainly science and engineering. They'll be learning different cultural things, and they'll be learning different humanities. But let me just say that there was a YouTube video that was, everyone knows the video I'm referring to, 500 million downloads. And so I asked some of my students in the US, do you know what this Gangnam Style is? And the students, they said, oh, you know about it. So they thought I'm not a fossil in the world. And then one of my very best students was a Chinese-American young woman, and she said, I've watched it 20 times. It is so cool. And then she said, the Koreans are so cool. And this is the spread of knowledge. In this case, it's cultural knowledge. I must say, I saw the video. I thought it was interesting. I thought Fred Astaire looks better when he dances, but that's a different era of life. Here's the international students, and that has grown faster than the growth of universities within countries, the global growth. So you see, in 75 is the first year I could get numbers, and then you get 2010. From 2000 to 2010, this more than doubled international students. And who are the top countries going into the US, which are the best here? Well, there's China. China's giant. There's India. And then there's the country with the highest proportion of people coming to the US, Korea. And Canada's a little bit behind. And then you have Taiwan is also very high. But it's truly amazing if you look at this, when you say, here are these two countries with the global of over 1 billion people. Neither one actually does a great, we don't know whether it's 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion, 1.5 billion. You see different estimates for China and India, like they have too many people to count. And there is Korea right behind them in this. This is globalization of the labor market inside the United States. This is Caterpillar hiring people in Peoria, Illinois. And you may know Peoria, Illinois is considered heartland of the U.S. You know, how does it play in Peoria? The politicians or the marketing people will say. What are they recruiting? They are recruiting in Chinese for Chinese graduates of the University of Illinois to work in China. I thought that's an amazing aspect of globalization of the people. Here are Chinese folks, most of whom I'm sure were graduate students, because the undergraduate enrollments are relatively modest, getting educated in the U.S., learning knowledge that an American company whose headquarters are in Illinois, I think Peoria, but I'm not sure, and that they're hiring, they're not going to Tsinghua, I'm not sure they are going to Tsinghua as well, and they may be at Seoul National also, but here they are hiring in the U.S. for China jobs. And I thought, gee, what if I'm an American student who graduated from the University of Illinois, and here's an American company, and I clearly do not have a chance unless I know some Chinese. So the language thing suddenly becomes clear to the American students for jobs. There's an area where people, particularly on the left, were deeply worried that globalization was going to bring great harm to working people. And that was in labor standards. You perhaps have all heard the thing, there's a low road in which what's going to happen is as the poorer countries with lower wages and poorer labor standards started getting more and more jobs, which they've done in the manufacturing area, it's going to spill over to worse standards elsewhere. And that's one of the main things people have been who are opposed to globalization. Turns out that is completely false. There is no evidence at all that any advanced country has backed off its labor standards. And what has happened in the third world countries, and I'm thinking particularly China, less so of India, there has been a tremendous pressure, both from the consumers in the advanced countries and from people in their own country who have latched onto the ideas that you should have free trade unions, that you should have more democratic rights, that standards should be implemented, not just in law, etc. And I think it's very striking that has occurred. And at the bottom I put the American multinationals are fairly famous with some of their anti-union things. America's been largely de-unionized because of the huge companies' pressure, and they have not been able to export that elsewhere. So Walmart, you may know, in the U.S. and Canada, when they tried to organize one Walmart, I think it was a butcher shop, the butcher part, they just closed the whole store down to let the workers know, never. Walmart is organized in China. And they've not been able to stick to the same policies that they've done in our country. So I think it's been the pro-worker and more standards ideas that have won, and the people on the left who were terrified globalization was going to bring a low road. It's exactly the opposite, because ideas trump, here I said ideas trump fears, but they trump some narrow interests. Once people learn about this is the way you should be treated as a worker, it spreads everywhere. This is the globalization of the production of knowledge. So I've divided this in two parts. There's the world R&D, which the data, these are UN-based data, and I don't have more recent data than 2009. You see the increase, it's in purchasing power parity dollars, so adjusted for currency differences. And you see then the shares. It's the same thing that is occurring in the university enrollments. The advanced countries' shares go down. And here, Korea is part of the advanced world. There's no question in the production of knowledge. That's Korea, and they went up, and they were the only advanced country that has gone up. Well, you might say they're intermediate advanced, not as advanced as the other countries, but the point is that they have risen. And then you see it's China making incredible movement in R&D, just rushing to the forefront. China has been extremely smart in really playing the game of it's the ideas, it's the knowledge. That's what you invest in. To the right, I give the same thing, slightly different dates because of the nature of the data, and where it's now world researchers. And of course, what you see there, and this is where it's clear Korea fits with the advanced countries. The advanced countries have a lower share of world researchers than they have of world R&D because people are being paid higher salaries. And there you see China's share there is almost 20% of world researchers. And we believe in part if they're paid less, then their skills are probably not up to the same as those in advanced countries. This is another measure of this knowledge passing globalization. And here I took the top 10 countries that produce science in engineering articles. And what you see is an increase in the world, the US a little bit below, China, the fastest growing, and then you go down, and oh my gosh, ninth place is Korea, 10%, the second fastest growing place for production of science and engineering articles. And that is going to reap benefits to the country, as time proceeds. That's a huge thing, and so that's the payoff, in some sense, to greater R&D and greater production of university people. And then the figures, interesting figure, the 2009 cumulative, this is 70%. 10 countries produce 70% of the science and engineering articles in the world. So that's a big 10. One way of international collaboration, it's not trade, it's something quite different, and it's very interesting, is co-authorship, where you collaborate with someone from another country. And on the left is the world articles. You see the rise of all co-authorships, and then the dotted line shows you the rise of international co-authorships. So in the world, it's over 20% of articles now are written with an American and a Korean and a Japanese, a French with a German. Okay, almost. Okay, thank you. Okay, and then I have the figures for the US. This is an example. I will not give it because I've been given a time signal. But this is just an example of how we fought this virus, and it just country after country contributed together. Went from one lab to another lab, things were rushed, and it was international collaboration in order to figure out to deal with the virus. And then I want to conclude with three policy-oriented, I call them issues or questions, that countries have. Do you educate people overseas versus do you strengthen your domestic universities? There's obviously some money in a pot, and the Ministry of Education or R&D has to decide, how do you make a division? Obviously, as an economist, you believe there probably is some optimal value. We don't know quite what it is. You wouldn't go to one extreme or the other, etc. And then I pointed out the importance of ethnic networks in that process. So Koreans in the U.S., my Korean friends in the U.S., and including U.S.-born Koreans, information flows back to Korea faster than it would flow to some other country from them. So there's this linkage that happens through people of the same ethnicity. And then I have some discussion of how hard it is to bring domestic universities to world class. Second question is the way in which you do international collaborations. Do you bring foreign professors here? Do you send your professors overseas? Do you send students go overseas? That's a big issue. But now what about the professors? And then this issue of how much R&D you do, basic and applied. My last comment is when a country is in this knowledge business, the knowledge is global, but some of the benefits you want to accrue to your own country, particularly if your taxpayers are paying for it. And that's the issue of making the benefits sticky. And I'll just say, question. There's an issue of what policies indeed can do that. And obviously we don't want it to do it too much, because if you do it too much, then it's no longer global knowledge and you've undone the whole process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank Professor Freeman's insightful presentation. And Freeman make a very relevant point, the importance of globalization of knowledge and also international cooperation of research and faculties. Yes. And now we'd like to invite, Ann Kruger's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor and pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation to come, and I certainly congratulate the organizers on the magnificent and I'm very sure very challenging organization of this important conference. My topic is a little bit different. I'm going back more to Prime Minister Brown's topic in terms of talking about the world outlook, although at the end I will talk about how that relates to Korea's challenges for growth and for education. I want to, I'll have to skip a bit because I don't have as much time as I expected, but in doing so, if this will move forward, I'm stuck. This is not moving. I'm pushing it. Yeah. Okay, good, thank you. Okay. Okay, once it began too fast. Okay, fine. I just very quickly, what I want to do, and as I said, there's more in the PowerPoint than we can cover, is to talk a little bit about how well the global economy performed in the last half of the 20th century, which increases or builds on the theme of globalization, but then talk about the shift to the international economy that has come about very rapidly at the beginning of the 21st century, and then move to the more recent cyclical developments, the financial crisis and all that, and then take a look at the short-term outlook. And to do that, I think we have to start with the European situation, then look at some of the challenges going forward in addition to that, which then enable us to look at the short-term outlook and then the longer-term outlook, and then where it goes for Korea. Let's see if we can get this going here. Okay. I want to start with the period since the Second World War because I think it's too often the case that people start by thinking about the last decade or the last 2 decades and say, oh, we had this terrible crisis, therefore we've got to throw out everything. And I assert that that is throwing out the baby with the bathwater, to use an old American expression or English expression, because basically we had a very successful 50 or 60 years of growth, as Prime Minister Brown mentioned earlier, and globalization has been very important for all of us. It's been important even for the many countries that have not done anywhere nearly as well as Korea. It's been important in many ways. We started after the Second World War with a very dominant United States economy. We then had the renaissance, I suppose, of Europe and Japan as they recovered from the Second World War. Everybody talks about the decline of the United States, and yet what is forgotten is that the United States worked very hard to bring the international economy back, to enable the attainment of developed status of the European economies, and to work for the development of others. And the decline was, as Prime Minister Brown said, inevitable, but it was a relative decline. American economic growth has not been all that bad. Until about 2000, American share of world GDP was going down. Of course, American GDP was going up, but its share was going down. Other countries were growing more rapidly, but in fact, starting from a low enough base, this happened slowly and did not really very much change the structure of the international economy or international decision-making. But as China began growing rapidly after the success of Korea and other East Asian countries, as developing countries began growing more rapidly after Europe had recovered, then the situation began changing not only quantitatively as it had been doing, but qualitatively, as again, as Prime Minister Brown said, so that the United States could no longer be quite the dominant economy that it had been earlier, and as I said, largely by design. And of course, the last decade has raised a lot of questions, so that's where we're going, and I'm going to skip quite quickly, except to point out that world economic growth the period from 1950, let's say, until 2000, is far more rapid than had ever happened in human history. In fact, if you cut down the period from 1950 to 1975, that was already the golden era, we then called it, of world economic growth, because it was faster than had ever happened before, although it was not much change between developed and developing countries. Developing countries began growing much more rapidly as they learned how to adopt their policies and so on, so that the second quarter century of the half century was one where all countries were doing, or almost all countries were doing better. And of course, globalization proceeded in all the ways that Professor Freeman mentioned, but also in terms of trade, of interconnectedness, and all sorts of other things. Tariff barriers between countries fell enormously. Non-tariff barriers at the border, quantitative restrictions, almost disappeared. All kinds of other things. Foreign direct investment increased, and so on. Transport costs fell enormously. And, of course, the time it took to communicate between countries has fallen. So all of these things have improved the quality of our lives, improved the availability of goods and services, and enabled the world economy to do a lot better. Private capital flows really dried up after the Great Depression. They did not start very much after the Second World War. By the 1960s, they resumed between Europe and the United States, but it was only in the 1990s that private capital flows between developed and developing countries became very important. And until that decade, official flows, i.e. foreign aid and stuff, were more important. All that has changed now as the private sector financial flows have boomed, and of course we've discussed some of the troubles with that. But overall, the world is much more integrated, and that integration played an important part in rising living standards everywhere. And so let me continue quickly. I said most of that. The oil price increases gave us crises a couple of times along the way. We had other issues, but the overall trend was very much toward increasing per capita income, increasing living standards, longer life expectancies, all of the things that we can use to measure the quality of life look to be, for the most part, in a favorable direction in most countries. Even during the various world crises until 2008, many parts of the world were very little affected and could keep growing. Most crises, the Asian crisis, the Latin American crisis in the 1980s, were more regional in that they did not affect the whole world economy, partly because we were not quite so integrated then. Now we are much more integrated, and now it's more difficult for things not to spill over. Now, most of the trends that have governing what's happening now did start in the last half century. But on the other hand, you know, when you start from a small base, it takes a while before you get bigger and bigger and it finally shows, and that's what has happened to us. I've already commented on the dominance of the world economy. The U.S. started with 40% of world GDP in 1945 or 46, way high, and of course is now down to half that as share. It's up there, absolutely. Developing countries did not increase their share. In fact, they lost share of world GDP and world trade until about 1973. Since then, they've reacquired it, and then their share began rising about 1997. Obviously, we also had the collapse of the Soviet Union in the latter part of the 19th century. But by 2000, tariffs by industrial countries on manufactured goods, because of WTO cooperation, multilateral tariff negotiations, were down to very low. Average tariffs on manufacturers by 1947 in the United States, other industrialized countries, Europe, were on the order of 45%. By 2000, they were down to 3%. Transport costs had also fallen enormously, and so the world was much more integrated on that and other counts. Now, we did have a downturn in 2000 and 2001 with the tech bubble, as it burst, and then of course we had 9/11. But for the first, 5-6 years after 2000, things grew very, very fast. The world economy had what appeared to be a very successful period with almost every country in the world joining in. Earlier on, there had been periods where part of the world was growing very rapidly, but for example, Africa had very little growth. or there were times when the Middle East had very little growth, or when the South Asia was not doing terribly well. But 2000 to 2006 looked on the surface to be a very good period, but global imbalances were growing, and by global imbalances I mean the same investment saving, or if you like, consumption investment imbalance that Prime Minister Brown talked about earlier, where indeed the United States was consuming, I would say, too much relative to its income, and the Chinese were consuming much less of their income, and I regard each of them as a mutual enabler of the other, meaning that the American behavior let the Chinese have their saving, and the Chinese behavior let the Americans have their expenditure, and we do need something going forward that can change all that. That led to that imbalance, and the Chinese surplus of savings let the Americans keep going and doing their thing until, of course, the construction bubble, the real estate bubble burst. Part of that was the result of the low real interest rates that came about because of the excessive savings in China. And because of that, it led into the financial crisis because you'd had the real estate construction boom because of low real interest rates. When interest rates are low, the thing that is more attractive right away is real estate of all kinds. And that in turn had then led to rising prices, and when they burst, it hurt many financial institutions, starting, of course, in the United States. Because of the fact that there had been too much construction before, after the height of the boom and after real estate prices began falling and then the financial crisis, recovery was bound to be slow because, first off, there was an overhang of housing on the market that had to clear. There was an excess supply. Prices had to fall. That had more repercussions. And so inevitably for that reason, as well as the indebtedness that Prime Minister Brown discussed, we had a major difficulty in that. Basically, by the last couple of years, things turned better. And they were beginning to improve. We'd hit the bottom in the financial crisis. Things were beginning to recover slowly. But then came the European crisis, which has now gone on for at least 2.5, 3 years, depending on how you count. The crisis that started in the United States spilled over, and by the time the recovery was starting in the U.S., what happened was, of course, that the major difficulties emerged in Europe, starting, of course, in Greece, but Ireland and Portugal soon followed. And we now have still very important questions about how the Spanish economy and Spain and Italy will do over the next few years. And the crisis of the euro has not been resolved. The European leaders say they will do everything. They have either the leaders or the finance ministers have a meeting. At that meeting they say, we are going to solve the problem by doing this. But then it turns out that you can't just have a banking union, for example. You have to agree on the rules for the banking union. And when you start discussing the rules, different countries have different banks, they have different regulations, and of course there are issues to be resolved. So all of the decision making within the Eurozone has been very slow and not terribly effective so far. So the crisis has dragged on, and with it a great deal of uncertainty about the future of the euro, about the future, therefore, of the whole European enterprise as it now stands. And that has put a damper, I think, on recovery, or the speed of recovery, most everywhere, certainly in the United States, most of all, of course, in Europe, but even in Japan. Chinese exports aren't growing as much to Europe as they would have otherwise. So the European situation is there not only because of what it is itself, but because of the uncertainty it has engendered with the rest of the world. And part of that is because of the financial interlinkages, because banks in Europe hold assets in banks in countries that are having problems, for example, Greece. If Greece does say they cannot any longer service their debt, that will affect European banks very much. But American banks and European banks have interrelationships, et cetera, et cetera. And so nobody knows exactly how these things are going to resolve, and that is a difficulty with the world economy at the moment. Not the only one, but a big one. Going forward, we've got a lot of issues. Even if the Eurozone crisis had not happened, fiscal sustainability would need to be restored because everybody spent a lot for stimulus in 2009, 2010. But with the Eurozone crisis, we have even more issues fiscally, and that's important. But not only that, the industrial countries are confronted with major challenges as their shifting demographics require significant fiscal adjustments to prevent sovereign debt difficulties. In Korea, you are facing, I believe, the peak in your labor force in 2017, which is going to mean that the demographic issues come on quickly because an older population has more demands on health, on social insurance than a younger population, and there are fewer workers per old person, and so there will be fiscal challenges everywhere as this problem comes along. Different countries face it to different degrees. China faces it surprisingly quickly also, so that there are problems that will come up even if we get through everything in the short run now. Some countries have already taken a number of measures to address these problems and made adjustment easier. And one thing about the prospective demographic difficulties is if you start earlier, it's much easier and less painful to correct them than if you wait until it's a real crisis. So for most of the industrial countries, the fiscal issues are predominant, quite aside from the fiscal cliff, which comes up immediately in the United States. It is estimated that if the American political body at the federal level cannot reach any decisions to change something, the net impact will be about a reduction of 5% of GDP coming from the federal budget as they spend less and they tax more as a result of the measures that are already legislated and would have to be changed. I think that at the last minute, and I believe it will be the very last minute, I believe we will all worry, and we will all think it's going to be terrible, but at the last minute, some kind of compromise will be undertaken so that we will not have the fiscal cliff in the United States. It is estimated that even if they don't reach that compromise on December 31st, much of the cut in expenditure and much of the increase in tax revenues will take a while to take hold, so there is a little bit of time in there where things could improve, or at least not be as bad as they would be if the 5% flow rate hit all at once. But even so, I'm going to now assume that we don't hit that because that's a tremendous uncertainty in the U.S. part in the short term. But as I said, I think some kind of compromise will be reached, and the American recovery in a number of regards looks quite strong. It's not as strong as it would have been without Europe. It's not as strong as it would be if we didn't have the uncertainties with the fiscal cliff. It's not as strong as it would be if some other things were happening, but nonetheless, there are signs that it is going to accelerate, including the fact that the news on the housing market now is turning out to be better than was expected. It looks as if the bottom has been reached. Housing prices seem to be rising. That will have all kinds of implications for household indebtedness. All sorts of other things are happening. So it looks as if the fiscal cliff isn't there, and if European uncertainties don't dominate, the American economy looks good for the next few years, although there is still a fiscal problem for the demographic changes coming up, but there are several years in which if the American Congress does do something right, that could be addressed. So basically, I'm going to look at the outlook when indeed we do not have the fiscal cliff and where we do have some kind of resolution of the Eurozone issues. Resolution of that would improve prospects for Europe, of course, but also for the United States, because then the American companies would not be faced with the problems they now face in Europe, both financial and real. 20% of American exports go to Europe. It's not a small number. And so that's about 3% of GDP, are American exports to Europe, which is a big number. The question, of course, arises on Spain, but if Spain somehow can manage with whatever proposals they have, and they get the banking union, that will, I think, be the end of the major uncertainties about the crisis, and things may gradually improve. Already there's a little bit more optimism in the markets than there had been on that as that might go forward. Okay, the large emerging markets really contributed greatly to buffering the 2009-2010 recession, or the 2008-2009 recession, because they continued growing. And lots of people talked about decoupling and how the emerging markets were no longer so dependent on developing countries, but that, of course, changed as they saw with the European situation, that indeed they too are vulnerable to it all. And so basically, with those countries are dependent, I think, to some extent on what happens in the West. We will not see negative growth. We're not going to see a downturn in China. The real question is what kind of rate of growth we will see, whether it will be 6%, 8%, in that range. India has a few more problems, so India looks as if from 8% it will be down to 5 or 6. So the large emerging market countries are not going to be able to provide as much stimulus to the international economy over the next 2 or 3 years as they did. So the real question is what happens in the Eurozone, and can the Americans avoid the fiscal cliff? If they do that, short-term prospects for the world economy can improve relative to what they now are, as those questions are overhanging markets. Longer term, there is the fiscal issue that I mentioned, which basically has to be addressed at the same time as people worry about growth rates with slower and even negative rates of labor force growth. That is the issue over the longer term. And basically, that in turn means that there have to be efforts to improve productivity, and particularly labor productivity, over the next decade and longer. The world trade has been an engine of growth throughout the past half century. We have a problem, as again Prime Minister Brown mentioned, because the Doha round is dormant in the water. And it is, I think, a very sad commentary on international cooperation that when there's so much to be gained and so little to be lost for everybody that we have not even been able to cooperate yet to complete that round. And spurring the WTO forward, I think, would be an important contribution to make longer-term growth better, and would, of course, be a measure to improve productivity. And particularly so in services, where we were close to getting some momentum toward more internationalization there, and where the failure to complete the Doha round so far has left that effort stalled. And yet in all of our economies, services are becoming more important, and measures to improve productivity there are important. Competition is a great spur to productivity improvement, and is one area where there are potential for significant gains. I don't want to comment particularly on Korea, but the evidence in Japan is strong that there's great evidence there. The U.S. higher growth rate over the past decade before the financial crisis was partly because American services productivity growth was greater than in most other industrial countries. Okay, financial institutions are another one where we do have more work to do if we want to secure the longer-term future. Again, Prime Minister Brown discussed that. We do need a more level playing field. Nobody has addressed the problems of too big to fail yet, which in my judgment are fairly large. And there does need to be some international coordination of regulatory frameworks. If some countries are fairly strict with high capital requirements and others are not, in the short run, the countries with the low capital requirements for their banks, their financial institutions will have a competitive edge, which is unfair. It's not an even playing field, but they're also the ones that will take more risk and will be more dangerous for the international economy in the years ahead. The demographic transition faces most of us, and the shifting composition of production to more capital and skilled labor-intensive methods has to take place. The human capital of the labor force is critical. It entails all the things that Professor Friedman said, including, of course, the internationalization of knowledge and so on and so forth. It includes removing distortions in the labor market, finding measures that will enable greater labor force participation of women in many countries, and all the rest of those measures will be terribly important. If the industrial countries can address these issues, the outlook for the countries that so far remain relatively low income will be quite good, because as our labor forces do not grow, there will be more scope for increasing the production of unskilled labor-intensive activities in the low-income countries, and that in turn would raise their growth rates, which would provide more of a market. And so, in a sense, getting these skill-related things under control, the education that we're talking about, is crucial for everything else. I'm being signaled to wind up, so I will wind up quickly. The next section, the implications for Korea. Obviously, Korea's success is known to everybody. The demographic challenge is rising quickly. And obviously, the measures to address it include measures to increase labor force participation, upgrade human capital in all the ways that we will be talking about for the next day and a half, plus what we've said already, and continued attention to removal of distortions, particularly in the labor market. And I think, from what I know of Korea, and this is an outsider's superficial view, the fact that some Korean workers are temporary and others are not, and the way it is done or the way it has been regulated, has led to problems that may need to be addressed in order to have a better functioning labor market going forward. But in any event, South Korea, I think, is well placed to address those issues. South Korean policymakers have in the past been very responsive to issues as they've arisen, and I think that will continue into the future. So I think that we could look for South Korea's economic performance to continue to be a leader in the world. I think there are a few opportunities for catch-up even in Korea left, but more and more growth has to be based on skilled capital, on knowledge, on innovation, and that, of course, is much of what this conference is about. And so I wish you great luck with the rest of it, and thank you very much.
Oh, it's amazing how Professor Kruger covers the past half century, world economic development and future economic outlook, as well as Korean economy in this limited time. Thank you very much for your outstanding presentation. Yes, the time this plenary session 1 is already ran out, but we'd like to take 1 or 2 questions from the floor. So, anyone to raise a question? We have a very limited time. No questions? Okay, let me see the time. Yeah. We have still 5 minutes more, so I'd like to then ask a question, one each speaker. And first to Professor Freeman. My question is, to what extent are conventional economic models still relevant in a world which is such great flows of knowledge? And also the other question to Kruger, Professor Kruger, is the concerning incentive, government incentive. In the short run, what incentive should the Korean government provide in the future? Yes. Yes.
The conventional economic models, we know, leave this huge residual for growth. It's about 70% of growth is unexplained. We call it advances in knowledge, but we actually don't have real metric for it. I always thought that was a negative thing about conventional economic models, but I want to remind everybody that conventional physics models, I think it's 97% of the matter in the world is dark matter, and they haven't a clue what that is. So it is true, there's a lot of things, and we at least know, we think if we could do better measures of knowledge and better measures of how it's applied, we will reduce this residual into something real. The physics guys, the astronomers, I don't think they're making great progress in finding the dark matter of the world.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Obviously, each country is different enough that it's very hard, unless you know a great deal about the nitty-gritty of the structure, to say what incentives should be granted. What I would say, though, is that in general, uniform across the board incentives at the governmental level normally work a great deal better than efforts to pick out this industry or that industry or the other activity for special treatment. Partly that's because it's very hard. I mean, the essence of the future is that we don't know everything about it. It is uncertain. And one problem with governments getting behind one set of activities is that they encourage those and they kind of discourage others. And very often, the things that are coming up may not be things that are that obvious in the shorter run. And therefore, I would argue very much against something where we said we're going to encourage innovation in the first industry, but not in the second. And so far as knowledge needs to be used and applied, okay, maybe a tax credit for R&D. I just don't know enough about the Korean structure to say, but not a tax credit for R&D in nano widgets. You know, that's the kind of thing that in general has worked very well. I think there's also much more scope for, should I say, political pressures lobbying once you get industry or activity-specific measures. And I think it's very desirable to avoid that and to stay with uniformity of incentives. The Korean authorities did that very well in the 60s and 70s, which was one of the major reasons for early success.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Freeman and also Professor Kruger's outstanding presentation and discussions. Now we are closing this first session, and can we have again one round of applause to both prominent speakers?
네, 감사합니다. 네, 정확하게 시간도 잘 지켜주셨는데요. 수고해주신 김준영 총장님과 소중한 강연해주신 여사분들께 다시 한번 감사 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 네, 이것으로 첫 번째 기조 세션 순서를 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다.